that we're trying to answer this week in the EdTech stream. The first question is a non-trivial one. Why EdTech? On a continent with so many other challenges in the education sector and also in technology, the question is, with these significant socioeconomic challenges, with the fact that we have schools that do not have proper infrastructure, toilets, sanitation, teachers, and a myriad of other basic requirements for a functioning education system, why are we focused now on education technology? The other question is, why do we not start off with focusing on building this robust functioning system before we then start thinking about additional extras, which in some of Africa's poorest schools don't seem to make sense? The second question we need to answer this week is, what will it take to make EdTech work in Africa? So here are the issues of access of content, of platform, of devices, of infrastructure capabilities, what it's going to take to work between the private and public sector, government, civil society, and the emerging startups and entrepreneurs becomes quite important. And this is kind of the practical tools that we're going to need to use to make EdTech take place. But the third question for me is actually the one that the paper, the EdTech pre-conference paper actually focuses on. Because the question of why EdTech is something that you can discuss as educationalists and as technologists in your workshops, in the digital talks, in breakfast, lunch at the restaurant. And the question of, what it's going to take to make it work is also something that technologists, et cetera, will be quite interested in. But I think the real question that hasn't really been addressed by any of the literature thus far is, how do you make this real? What is it going to take to make this practical? So this is where the juncture at which the educationalist and the technologist is going to meet each other, thinking about what is the why and the what are the needs, what are the tools, and how can they put them together. So the topics thus bearing in mind this question of how do we make it real that we've covered in the pre-conference paper. What are the platforms and players in the ecosystem? So we have a very basic, brief, non-exhaustive look at what kind of platforms have been applied recently in Africa EdTech, as well as the players from a variety of perspectives in the ecosystem. We also look at what are the challenges that are most critical to resolve. So we understand that the list of challenges is quite long, but there are some that we believe are more critical than others to resolve in order to make a real scaling up of EdTech in Africa. There's also the question of emerging technologies. And here I think is the part where technologists get particularly excited, right? And also where the paper, I think, for some of those technologists is a little bit less exciting. We don't talk about chatbots. We don't talk about machine learning or deep learning, the use of advanced analytics, big data. Because here we try to figure out what are the things that have the most potential to be real in Africa in the next 5 years. And to be honest, while the concepts of machine learning, deep learning, et cetera, are very exciting and cool, and we wish that we could use drones to drop off textbooks in rural schools, we've chosen to focus on emerging technologies that are a little bit more on the practical side. And then the last question is kind of what could EdTech at scale look like in Africa? And I think while it's a topic that's explored in the digest, it is principally the role of the workshops and the discussions that we're having to get to that vision. So let's start with the basics. The what? So in terms of educational platforms, we all know the MOOCs and online educational content. We also know the controversy surrounding this content, given that we still have no way of actually understanding how successful these online courses have really been in changing educational outcomes, specifically at primary and secondary, but also if we look at the Coursera's of the world, Ubongo in Tanzania, I've talked about the African Virtual University in Cambia, and the Egyptian Knowledge Bank. All of these cases are discussed in more depth in the paper, but the reality is that for MOOCs, the jury is still out on how effective these really are. There's also been something which I think ordinary schools are much more familiar with and ordinary educators are much more familiar with at this point, which is the learning management systems, the learning content management systems, and other collaborative tools. I think a very interesting example of this is the Data-Driven Districts project in South Africa led by the MSDF Foundation and the Basic Department of Education. Because what they've done is take it out of the domain of the school and the educator and try to think about if we really have to scale the idea of learning management systems, How do we make this something which a teacher inputs data and then 2 days later can see the data for not just their classroom, not just their school, not just their district, but also for their province and in fact the whole country. So you could have a look at what is the grade 1 performance in mathematics of this term in the country as an ordinary teacher and be able to see what the trends are and understand. So that for me is quite interesting. There's also the question of adaptive assessment and test preparation services. I think this is something which has gained a lot more popularity in the United States, where standardized testing is much more of a feature. But there are some examples of African startups that are trying to do this in a particularly African way. So School Desk in Uganda is a good example of a startup that's trying to think about how do you prepare students for school testing environments and how do you assess them in ways that help teachers to be able to provide more individualized support to learners. There's then the question of game or simulation-based tools. So these learning tools, such as Dreambox, I think there's also a lot of them that take the learner through a narrative journey, are quite interesting. And some of the players that we see involved in these, a lot of the startups are really in the gaming area, but also in a lot of others. I think Juliana last night did a good discussion about what the startup ecosystem for EdTech looks like in Kenya, but there's also a lot of other examples. I think in terms of government involvement, we have seen a leaning towards the Anglo-Saxon countries, the Anglophone countries, rather than Francophone countries in terms of the scale at which EdTech is advancing. That's starting to change more recently with more government support and government buy-in for the programs. But still, we see quite a lot of this innovation is actually coming from the NGO sector. The nonprofits, those donors and foundations have become large implementers and large financiers of EdTech at scale. So the startups and governments still have very localized, very small products, but it's those NGOs that are really getting scale. And the one player that we actually tend to forget in this conversation is actually the schools and educators. And it's one of the challenges, actually, we point out, the agency challenge in education, which I'll talk a bit more about later, which actually results in sometimes we develop products which actually do not speak to the real educational outcomes in the classroom, but rather do something which is cool and exciting from a technological perspective, but not necessarily given those contexts. So that problem of the principal agent problem in education, I think is especially relevant for people who are trying to consider how do you design a product where someone else is paying for it, perhaps a donor, where the government has certain mandates and you're trying to develop a curriculum or a story that goes with what they are trying to achieve, when schools themselves have very basic challenges about just how to improve learner outcomes for a group of 100 or 1,000. And you as a startup are, to be honest, just trying to make a living and try to get your product to learners as fast as possible. When there are so many different stakeholders, it means that the producer of that content has to prioritize and make sacrifices at the expense of stakeholders. And the stakeholders that it usually comes at the expense of are educators, because teaching administration and teaching staff aren't usually either paying for it, or going to be the end recipients for it, monitoring and evaluating it, reporting on in the media, or ensuring that the startup's going to get more funds to continue to do that. Another challenge which we think is fundamental is the systematic failures in traditional delivery of education. Because the reality is that no EdTech is going to replace the education system or make a poorly functioning education system function particularly better. If you're starting off with a base of 0, you're probably still going to, even if you improve the effectiveness by 2,000% with the use of technology, you're still at 0. And so I think it's something incredibly important that we do not lose sight of. How do we design systems that support teachers to make traditional delivery of education smarter and more efficient, and help them improve their skills to do that, while also considering the technologically interesting topics? I think the third challenge that I want to talk about is one of funding and financing. It's actually one of the topics for one of the workshops that we have running at Africa for Tech this week, because we feel it is so fundamental that we resolve the question of if there are billions that are flowing into the international edtech sector, and we understand that many startups are now starting to raise some serious capital around this, why is it that so few South African, West African, North African, East African startups can find funding to actually do this? Why can schools not secure the kind of funding they need to develop solutions that make sense in their individual context? And it is also a question that Juliana raised last night, because the reality is we're all still trying to figure out how this is going to work. And I want to challenge the participants of the workshop who are doing funding and financing to consider what alternative business models and operating models can we consider for funding. Ones that are a blend of the recurring revenue, the donor-funded, the government-funded, and the freemium models, for example. Other challenges that we understand, so low teacher proficiency with technology and innovation, low motivation, insufficient technical infrastructure, that includes just basic electricity, not just connectivity and smartphones, etc. There is also the colonial education legacy, which I spoke on a little bit, of the divide between Francophone and Anglophone countries. Wealth and gender disparities also mean that those who tend to access, for example, MOOCs and online courses tend to be those who already have degrees or already have some basic tertiary education. So it means that those who are the ones who actually need it most, who need it first, or actually only ever get it much further down the line, and probably not in the format of a MOOC or an online course. Gender is also a huge disparity, with women overwhelmingly being shown to be marginalized in the edtech delivery space, except for in the NGO space, where people are very committed to the idea of trying to get more women there. And so then we look a little bit in the paper also about the emerging technologies and what are the opportunities. So blended learning, we believe, is going to be one of the most important features of this. So the idea behind blended learning is that you need to have a good mix of technology and in-person so that you can reinforce the lessons that technology is trying to put across to the learners, with also the continuous assessment and testing and understanding and reinforcement from teachers themselves. There's also the very controversial issue of school in a box, which if you want to talk to me at the restaurant about it, I will share my personal opinions, but which is something that people are considering about what does the future of the school look like? And maybe it is in a box, and maybe it is just a prepackaged learning solution where the teacher needs to do nothing more than take a tablet and read off the tablet, and the students all have their tablets and everyone's working in a very connected way through a very centralized program. It is one of the emerging technologies and certainly worth considering if we have challenges with it or if we believe in it, how to make it work functionally and also work bearing in mind the local context and realities of particular locations. I think that given the millions of new teachers that we will require with such a growing youth population, the question of how we're going to use mobile teaching and teaching development at scale is also really important, and how we can use mobile phones to get teachers to move beyond the traditional models of teaching development into something new. So then the question is, so what now? So we understand that there are certain basics to a functioning education system. So McKinsey lists 6 of them here: building instructional skills, assessing students, improving data systems, facilitating improvement of documents and laws, revise standards of curriculum, ensuring appropriate reward and remuneration structures for both the teachers and participants. And EdTech could support all of these. But the question is how? We believe, myself and the other writer of the EdTech paper, Richard Cheng, believe that government is not a particularly good innovator for innovation. So it has to come from the private sector, or at least civil society, the real innovation. Government does have a role to play in supporting this, both financially and through systems and enablers, but it is quite a difficult problem to solve. And in reality, countries need to take a very long, hard look at how much investment they realistically want to make in EdTech, given the basic infrastructure challenges and what they might need to put in place first to make it actually work. And so we believe that the future of education in Africa is certainly going to be a digital future. It is definitely going to be something which integrates technology meaningfully into the education ecosystem. But how that looks certainly has to be very different in Africa for how it has been in the West and in more developed economies. And there's still a lot of work to be done to figure out how do you combine multiple platforms, not just mobile phones, not just online, but also print, radio, which more Africans still have access to than any other medium, television, and social networks, right? So this is Africa for Tech's education pre-conference paper. Quick run through.
Thank you very much, Bontle. So, yeah, for those of you who have the yellow pass, which I think there's many of you, you can have access to the paper, the pre-conference paper, in your own workshop. We brought this morning all the people from the EdTech workshop, but we will also release the paper, the conference paper, enriched with the collective work of the workshop later in late 2016. So thank you, Bontle, very much. If you have any questions, we can run some Q&A for a few minutes. So before welcoming Kwam on stage.
I have one question. You say government have problem to promote tech in the country because they are agile tech, and you say is company, is organization that can help to promote edutech. Now the question is how those organizations can meet those like startup. How can them work together in order to find a good solution to promote the edutech in African country?
So work together with governments? How can the startups work together with government?
Yeah, with government.
Okay. So I think that I believe that governments can be very supportive of edtech once it exists. So once they have seen that there is a model and people have actually tested it in environments, it's at least been my experiences working on the ground in South Africa and Sierra Leone, that once an emerging technology has come about and there's an edtech or a small NGO that's actually managed to pilot that in a real situation, government is much more likely to want to support it and put their name behind it. Because it means, in a sense, one, there's less for them to do, because now they just have to think about how do you scale this and how can you support this and give this money. And the second thing is you can also avoid a lot of the bureaucratic kind of things that people have to jump through in a normal government organization if it's already set up. And I think the key for local startups and for local NGOs has to be working with local government first. So first engage the community, the local chiefdom, the mayor of your town first, because they are the ones that can help to carry it through the structure upwards. It's very difficult to start at the Minister of Education and move downwards unless you are a Google or an Amazon. It's much easier if you can find and make local relationships with people who have other relationships with people higher up in the chain to bring it upwards and scale it organically through that.